Hello and welcome back to Front Runner Motorsport, and it's very nearly our first birthday. Actually, it was our first birthday about a month ago, but I didn't have any internet at the time, so we're doing it now. Today we are going to take one final look at the drivers who have raced in both Formula 1 and the British touring cars, with a mega jumbo bundle pack of 18 drivers from the past to have battled with the greats in the pinnacle of single-seater racing, as well as enjoying bloody combat in the Mad Max-like hellscape that is the British touring cars. So with that said, please remember to subscribe. It is the 1 year birthday, so special occasions. Now's the time to press the button. With that said, sit back, relax, and let's begin.
Welcome to Front Runner Motorsport.
Jackie Oliver, a driver with a Formula 1 career spanning 10 years, although not much luck in those 10 years. Started with Lotus in 1967, not much to shout about except a podium at Mexico in 1968, before ruining his career with BRM over the next couple of years. Just 2 points finishes in 2 years, before a few appearances with McLaren, BRM again, and a full drive with Shadow, where Jackie Oliver would get another podium at Canada in 1973. It was his only points finish that year, and he'd disappear from Formula 1 until a one-off appearance with Shadow in 1977. He'd drive a Class D Ford Mustang for DR Racing in the BTCC in 1966 and 1967, finishing 4th overall in 67 and second in class behind Frank Gardner. He'd make a couple of appearances for Alan Mann in a Ford Escort in 1968, win Le Mans with Jackie Ickx in a Ford GT40 in 1969, and he would be one of the owners of the Arrows Formula 1 team until he resigned in 1999. Quite a mixed career. Mike Parkes. How does 6 races for Ferrari in Formula 1 sound? Good? Then Mike Parkes did good. He was also an engineer that worked on the Hillman Imp. His first short foray into Formula 1 was in 1959, when he failed to qualify a Formula 2 car for David Fry. He'd find success with Ferrari in sports car racing, and when in 1966 John Surtees suddenly left the team, he was promoted to Grand Prix racer. He finished second on his Ferrari debut at France, followed by a couple of retirements and another second at Monza. He'd only start 2 races in 1967, a 5th at Spa and a crash at Zandvoort, spinning in Jackie Stewart's oil, and unfortunately Michael Parkes would break his legs and it would be the end of his Formula 1 career. As for touring cars, he'd race a Sunbeam Rapier in 1960, but failed to finish his only start. In 1961 he finished 2nd overall and 1st in class, driving a Jaguar for Equip Endeavour. His final year in 1962, he'd finished 5th overall with teammate Jack Sears winning the Class D championship. And sadly, after a successful career in sports cars, touring cars and single-seaters, Michael Parkes would be killed in a car crash in 1977 in Italy. Henry Taylor. A smattering of Formula 1 appearances with Reg Parnell in 1959 and 1960, his only points finish was a 4th in France. He'd raced for the British Racing Partnership in 1961, but only qualified for 3 races with a best 10th. Henry Taylor's sole BTCC appearance was in 1963 in an Alan Andrews Ford Anglia Super. He also entered Fords in rallying before retiring in 1965. What else can you say but average? Peter Arundel. I feel really bad for Peter Arundel. He was a driver with a lot of promise, snatched away in one incident that ruined his career. He debuted for Lotus in 1964, getting 3rd place in his first 2 starts at Monaco and Zandvoort. He'd score further points in France, but his season was cut short after a Formula 2 crash at Reims with Richie Ginther. That crash threw Arundel from his car and left him severely injured. Colin Chapman kept a seat ready for him when he recovered, which didn't happen until 1966. But he didn't enjoy much more success and left Formula 1 at the end of that year. He had success in touring cars as well though. In 1964 he tied 5th in the overall standings and 2nd in class behind champion and teammate Jim Clark. in a Team Lotus Cortina. In 1966, Arundel would finish 3rd overall, but he would win his class ahead of Jim Clark. He'd enter 3 more races in 1968 in a Ford Escort for Alan Mann, before retiring entirely from motorsport in 1969. It's a shame after a great start to his Formula 1 career that it was over so quickly. JeanLouis Schleser. Looking at JeanLouis Schleser's Formula 1 and BTCC career, it doesn't really do him justice. He only made 1 appearance in Formula 1. After failing to qualify for Ram in 1983, he'd finished 11th for Williams at Monza in his only actual race in 1988. His 3 BTCC races came in Tom Walkinshaw's Rovers. In 1984 he entered 2 races, finishing 4th and 2nd, and a single run out in 1986, a 2nd place at Brands Hatch. So not bad on average. Elsewhere he was a French touring car champion, World Sports Car champion, and Dakar Rally winner on multiple times, so in fact he's a pretty good driver, just not in Formula 1. Johnny Dumfries, or also known as John Crichton Stewart, 7th Marquis of Bute, me lord. He had a single season in Formula 1 in 1986 with Lotus as teammate to Ayrton Senna, who basically destroyed him, and Lotus ditched Dumfries for Satoru Nakajima because they had Honda engines for 1987. It wasn't all bad though. In 1988 he won Le Mans with Jaguar. His only 2 BTCC races were the endurance rounds in 1988 and 1989, where he would share a Caliber Sierra with Guy Edwards, who was the first ever person I talked about on this whole channel. They'd finished 3rd in 1988 and were disqualified in 1989 because Win Percy drove the car illegally after the Rouse car retired. He retired in 1991 and now sits on a big throne in his house or something. Johnny Herbert. I like Johnny Herbert. From coming back from a huge crash in International F3000 to make his debut in Formula 1 with Benetton in 1989, making appearances for Lotus for 5 years when they were terrible and it wasn't helping his career, before moving back to Benetton, taking his first wins in 1995, podiums with Sauber, a final win with Stuart Ford in 99, and a final year for Jaguar in 2000. It's a solid career to look back on. His only 9 appearances in BTCC was as a mid-season replacement for James Thompson with Team Halfords. He scored points but also retired a lot. He's also raced in the International Superstar Series, scoring a win in Kyalami, as well as a win at Le Mans for Mazda in 1991, as well as 3 seconds in a row between 2002 and 2004. A great driver and a great career. Martin Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly made his Formula 1 debut in 1989, replacing the injured Derek Warwick at the French Grand Prix and finishing 12th in his Arrows, 3 laps down. A year later he was at Lotus having a really bad time. Have I mentioned Lotus kinda sucked at this point? Well, their Lamborghini engines usually blew up. Martin Donnelly would score no points and was then severely injured at Jerez in Spain, after which he was no longer able to race in Formula 1. 25 years later he wound up racing an Infiniti for the comically bad Support the Powers racing team. After a best finish of 19th he was replaced after Infiniti withdrew their support for the team. Replaced by Max Coates, a driver who routinely almost wins the Renault Clio UK Cup on a yearly basis. That's pretty embarrassing. John Love. I've talked about John Love on the channel before, although quite a while ago. For those who don't know, he was a driver from Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, who usually entered the South African round of the Formula 1 Championship, nearly winning in 1967 in his privately entered Cooper Climax, except he had to stop for fuel and Pedro Rodriguez took the win with Love in second. He was entering South African Grand Prix with his own team until 1972. He was also a British touring car champion in 1962, when Cooper hired him to race a Mini in the series. He won the championship in his debut year, but the next couple of years after this he'd make a couple more appearances. He was also a Formula 1 South Africa champion, before retiring in the mid-70s. Joachim Mass. I can't actually find out much information about Joachim Mass's time in British touring cars. He's listed on the official website as having an overall win, but the most I can find is at least a class win in a Group D car. I don't know what car, but that may or may not be Joachim Mass's time in the British touring cars. I don't know why it's such a secret, maybe he killed someone. As for Formula 1, he had a couple of bad years with Team Surtees starting in 1973, before moving to McLaren towards the end of 1974. He'd win his one and only race in Spain in 1975 and would get 8 podiums in his 3 years with the team, before moving to ATS for some reason in 1978 and the fairly new Arrows team in 1979, scoring the odd points finish up to 1980 before a final half season in 1982 with March. He was also a European Touring Car champion in 1972, a Deutsche Rennsport Meisterschaft champion in 1985, the forerunner to DTM, and Le Mans with Sauber Mercedes in 1989. It is quite an impressive career, and he still races classic cars every now and again. Stirling Moss, one of the greatest legends of Grand Prix racing, the man who finished second 4 times in Formula 1, who gave up a world championship because he didn't want Mike Hawthorne to be disqualified. He is an absolute wonder. One of the final championships he raced in was the 1980 BTCC season, racing for GTI Engineering, driving an Audi 80 GLE. Ending the championship in 16th place, probably not the achievement he's most proud of, but at this point he was 50, and I was very sad to hear Stirling Moss had passed away recently. He is an absolute legend of the sport. Godspeed, sir. Martin Brundle. I had no idea Martin Brundle raced in the British touring cars. It was very early in his career, a while before he began in Formula 1. He raced a Toyota in 1977, 78 and 1980 to little success. It's again very hard to find information from this time. He is a true journeyman of Formula 1. After 3 years with Tyrrell from 1984 to 1986, he'd moved to Zakspeed in 87, a single race for Williams in 88. He raced for Brabham in 89 and 91, before a good season with Benetton where Brundle would get 5 podiums. Then it was Ligier in 1993, McLaren in 1994, back to Ligier for 1995, and a final year with Jordan in 1996. Never a winner but a consistent point scorer, a winner at Le Mans in 1990 with the Silk Cut Jaguar, and in 2020 can be heard talking us through the action on the Sky F1 coverage. Kinda wish he'd go back to the BTCC though, for some reason. Dan Gurney, an American who pretty much won races in everything he entered, debuting with Ferrari in 1959 for 4 races, in which he'd get 2 podiums. He'd moved to BRM in 1960 but had a terrible year, and moved to the Porsche team in 1961, getting a smattering of podiums and a win in France in 1962. Another move to Brabham in 1963, and he would take another 2 wins and a handful of podiums over the next 3 years, before moving to the All-American Racers, or Eagle, a team that sounds like an absolute joke, but they did take Gurney to his 4th and last win in 1967. He'd enter 3 races for McLaren in 1970, but his Formula 1 career was over by this point. He was also a consistent IndyCar runner, winning USAC races, as well as 3 podiums at the Indy 500, wins in NASCAR, winner of the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1967 with a GT40. He'd make the odd appearance in BTCC in a Chevrolet Impala in 1961, before changing to a Ford Galaxy in 63 and 64. Denny Hulme. Finally a Formula 1 champion. In his 10-year career, Denny Hulme only raced for 2 teams. It was with Brabham in 1967 he'd take his first 2 wins and his championship, before spending the next 7 years with McLaren, taking 6 more wins before retiring after the 1974 season. He'd only make 4 appearances in the BTCC, 1962 in an Austin Mini, 63 and 64 in a Ford Galaxy. He has also raced at Daytona, the Indy 500, the Bathurst 1000, Le Mans, and pretty much everything else. Jack Brabham. Now we are getting into the big boys. The 3-time Formula 1 champion from Australia, surprisingly also raced in the BTCC, although in this period of time it wasn't that unusual. As you will see with the drivers coming and some of the ones before, it was normal for F1 drivers in the 50s and 60s to also race in the Tasman series, a bit of touring cars here, a few sports car races there, some Formula 2 on the side. They were very busy people. You wouldn't be allowed to do it nowadays. Brabham took his first 2 championships in Formula 1 with Cooper in 1959 and 1960 before winning it with his own team in 1966. 14 wins in 126 starts is a massive achievement, and he can be prouder of that than he can be of his own kids. He'd win his BTCC debut in 1963 in a Ford Galaxy at Snetterton, He'd take another win in 1960, but only entered a couple of races. 65 and 66, he'd changed to a Ford Mustang, taking a single win each year, and he'd make a surprise return to the series in 1980, driving a Renault 5 Gordini at one round. Graham Hill. Well, I made a mistake in the last video. I said Roy Salvadori was probably the first Formula 1 driver to race in the British touring cars, when actually Graham Hill was involved in the 8th ever race in British touring car history. In 1958, driving an Austin A35 to first in class, he'd win 8 races overall, finishing a best third in 1963, racing a Jaguar, before a last season in 1967 in a Lotus Cortina. As for Formula 1, a championship for BRM in 1962 and another for Lotus in 1968, he'd also win Le Mans and the Indy 500 to become the only Triple Crown winner. He'd started his own team, Embassy Hill, from 1973, but died in a plane crash in 1975 before the team could ever be successful. His son Damon would also race in the BTCC 22 years after Graham last raced in the series. Jim Clark. One of the greatest of all time, Jim Clark was taken away from the world far too soon. 25 Formula 1 wins in 72 starts, a win percentage Lewis Hamilton could only dream of. 2 championships in 63 and 65, his final win was in the first race of 1968, before his untimely death at Hockenheim in a Formula 2 race. Along with his Indy 500 win, 3 Tasman Series wins, and all the non-championship Grand Prix wins, he was also a BTCC champion in 1964. He'd take 8 wins between 1963 and 1966, winning his championship in a Lotus Cortina, probably the greatest all-round race driver of all time. Jackie Stewart, the final man on our list and another one of the greatest. The Scot who won 3 Formula 1 World Championships with Matra and Tyrrell. He won in his debut season in 1965 with BRM in Italy. It would be the first of 27 wins, the most at the time. He was also a Tasman Series champion, but he never had success at Le Mans where some of his peers had. He only had 1 attempt at it. A best 6th in the Indy 500 as well, and also 2 races in the BTCC. I had no idea Jackie Stewart raced in the BTCC, but he had 2 races in a Lotus Cortina in 1964, finishing 5th at Alton Park and 4th at Aintree. And that is the whole list of 48 Formula 1 drivers who have raced in the British touring cars. So as I said, we are past the 1-year anniversary of the birth of this channel, but I didn't have internet at the time, so I'm going to do something on the 31st of July. I can't believe I have over 60 subscribers. Honestly, I'm lucky to have 1. Thank you so much for subscribing, commenting, liking the videos and coming back to the channel to see new content when it goes up. I hopefully will be doing something on the 31st of July, maybe a live stream if the internet works long enough to let me, so make sure you tune in for that. With that said, thank you and have a good one.